These are our objectives, and we're going to talk about what racial trauma is, where it comes from, some core psychological wounds, some health challenges and vulnerabilities, how it affects treatment and recovery support, and what each of us can do to help. So if we're going to talk about racial trauma, we got to start by saying what it is. First, I want to clarify that when I say trauma, I do not mean post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. PTSD is a very specific diagnosis of a condition that's one of the many things that can happen to people who are exposed to trauma. Today, we're going to be talking about the larger category of trauma and about a specific type of trauma in there. So here's a pretty good definition of racial trauma from Mental Health America. It's mental and emotional injury caused by encounters with racial bias, ethnic discrimination, racism, hate crimes, a mental injury that can occur as the result of living within a racist system or experiencing events of racism. And that kind of makes it sound like it's a combination of a lot of different things that pile up over time, which it is. Everything from historical trauma to, something snarky that the waiter just said that you knew was kind of aimed at you. So it's helpful to think in terms of toxic stress. And that term is used for that chronic everyday stress that has a hefty cumulative effect sometimes. Also, it's good to think in terms of weathering, a process of chronic stress that kind of wears people's bodies and emotions down like the paint on an old building. It's been worn away by, the wind and the rain. So let's talk for a couple of minutes about some of the components of racial trauma. And to do that, before we get to the 12 ways, I'd like to stop sharing my screen for the first time. I see a bunch of squares. And welcome, everybody. I'm hoping we can brainstorm some examples of racial trauma. So just, throw out, this is an example, that's an example. Everybody here came in with an idea of what racial trauma is. You can just unmute yourself if you want to share your picture. Or you instead of your picture, that's wonderful. But if you just want to be a talking name, that's fine too. But I think it'll be much more useful if we hear from each other as well as just me. You can either just unmute yourself and talk, or if a lot of people are talking and you have something you want to say, you can always do that thing where you go to reactions and you click raise hand. So what are some examples of what racial trauma looks like?
Microaggressions.
Microaggressions, excellent.
Minimizing someone's concerns or not believing what they're saying.
Yep. Minimizing concerns, not believing.
Changing the rules when a person of color comes on board.
Changing the rules, yes.
Also not, when it comes to rules, not applying the rules fairly to everyone, picking and choosing who has to follow the rules.
Yep. Yes.
I guess assuming somebody's lifestyle and how much knowledge they know based off their race.
Yes, assuming lifestyle, knowledge, intelligence based off their race. What are some other examples?
I've experienced this aggressiveness unnecessarily. I can't describe it in any other way at this moment, but when they're prepared to manage you.
I think you were saying something about aggressiveness. Your microphone has a lot of resonance to it.
Ms. Pam, there are a few comments in the chat.
Excellent. So that'll be one of them. Could you read them, Mr. Cameron?
Yes, ma'am. Someone says microaggressions. Miss Missy Smith said inequalities in sentencing and the justice system. There's another comment that says ignorance. There's another comment that says over-sexualizing or over-adulting Black children. And then again, more comments around over-policing in Black neighborhoods, hate crimes, and then specifically as it relates to individuals being treated aggressively, like they put on battle gear to have a conversation. So a comment around community and neighborhood violence.
Yes. Yes. Any more before we move on?
Questioning someone's qualifications unnecessarily.
Yes. And assuming, I mean, like, how many Black people have had to say, no, it's the Harvard in Massachusetts that I went to.
Assuming, over assuming.
Yes. And we'll be coming from.
She's got cancer throughout her body, so all we can do is.
I would like to add that I worked in the school system, so misdiagnosing, like, and I put it in the chat, but I wanted to elaborate, like IEPs, and we've been misdiagnosing like children with autism, not getting the services that they need because they label them as intellectual delays or not getting the true diagnosis that will give them the help they need because they're of color.
Yes. Very common. So this webinar is about how racial trauma happens, how it affects people. If you're coming at it instead from a clinical standpoint, like diagnosis and treatment of racial trauma, most of the clinical resources are pretty new, but they're growing all the time. So there's the work of Monica Williams and colleagues. They've done a lot of a lot of scales. And the work of Resma Menakem has a wonderful, safe, somatic approach. I think it can make a whole organizational culture safer and more healing. So the fact that I'm not going into the clinical parts of it, part of it is that I'm not a clinician, I am a writer. But part of it is that I think we have to understand how it affects us as clinicians or as practitioners, and then go into the more specialized case. So I'm going to share my screen again. And before we go any farther, I should talk about the elephant in the room. In case anybody doesn't recognize her, this is Snow White, and these are all her little forest friends. And Snow White is wondering, what can somebody who looks like me possibly tell you about racial trauma? In fact, of course, people who looked like me invented racial trauma. We spread it all over the world in a whole bunch of ways, like colonialism, kidnapping, slavery, Jim Crow, race massacres, a whole bunch of ways all down history. And we keep it going every day. Of course, that doesn't give me any expertise in racial trauma, but I've been studying and writing about trauma since the early 90s. And when I started to grasp the sheer enormity of racial trauma, that's what drew me into studying and writing about health equity in the first place, starting with history and working with the Center of Excellence. Can non-Hispanic white people ever really understand racial trauma at the depth that people of color can? I do not think so. We all have our individual experience of deprivation and othering and bullying, harassment, but there's nothing like living in a whole society that's been baked in it, with centuries worth of momentum behind it. Turning on the TV and there it is, having large numbers of total strangers hate you sight unseen for no reason. But I do think, so I cannot understand what that feeling is, but I do think it's important for at least a few non-Hispanic white voices to be talking about what racial trauma is and where it comes from. Because racial trauma is not this mysterious disease that appears out of nowhere and we just got to deal with it. We have to at least acknowledge the causes of racial trauma, both the historical causes and the ongoing everyday causes. But to understand that, we have to understand just a little bit about being white in America. And do not pretend to talk for all white people or about all white people. What I'm going to say is true of a lot of us. And it resonates with the words of a lot of highly respected authors and researchers, white people and people of color. I was raised in a society that was heavily influenced by an elaborate framework of lies about the supposedly subhuman nature of people who are not white, and especially about Black people. Starting way back in the Middle Ages, there were many lucrative financial reasons for that framework of lies, and it has worked remarkably well for centuries. Now, I did not invent that framework of lies, but it was all around me when I was learning about the world. It was in my family, it was in my white neighborhood, and it was on TV. And of course, as soon as there was an internet, it was all over the internet, right? And that framework of lies is still been built into many of the policies that affect everybody's health and well-being. It's in a lot of deeply ingrained attitudes too, conscious attitudes, unconscious attitudes. And of course, my attitudes, even the ones I'm not aware of, can affect your opportunities. And they certainly affect the way I interact with you. Now, in many white circles, including mine, that old framework of lies is out of fashion now, right? But human beings are sponges. From the time we're born, we absorb what's around us. Even when we grow up and develop rational minds and moral codes and everything, we can't just wring out all that old stuff that we've absorbed and started over. I mean, if we could figure out how to do that, we would put all of you out of a job. So sometimes I'm going to forget and I'm going to say something or do something that's insensitive, that's disrespectful, maybe even something insulting to a person of color, maybe without even knowing it, and certainly without wanting to hurt anybody, but that doesn't make it not hurt. And here's a big part of the problem. Since I'm basically a good person and a caring person, the idea that I've insulted you is intensely uncomfortable to me. And if that discomfort keeps me from recognizing mistakes, or if it keeps me from owning my mistakes, I am going to make things worse. I'm going to gaslight you. I might pretend I never said what I said, and I'm going to hope that you didn't notice. But you probably did notice because you've heard it a million times. And for centuries, especially for African Americans, recognizing the insults has been an important tool for survival. And if I think what I've done is small, well, it still might be the 10th little insult you've had today, on top of all the other big and little insults your whole life. And when I don't acknowledge it, that's like saying you didn't experience what you experienced. And it all adds up because racial trauma is not just this one thing that happened, right? It's a conglomerate. It's all the straws on the camel's back. And if I don't acknowledge it, that becomes part of that great big lie that is racial trauma, that is the cause of racial trauma. So telling the truth becomes part of the healing. And that's as true in treatment as it is in families, in communities, in recovery communities. Telling the truth becomes part of the healing. Basically, well-meaning white people have no idea how dangerous we are. All our lives, of course, people were telling us Black people were dangerous to us. But if you understand racial trauma and how it gets activated, see it a little differently. I will say none of this makes me a bad person, doesn't make me feel guilty about being white. It just makes me responsible for becoming more aware of myself, more aware of my biases, and more aware of my potential to hurt people. So those thoughts are pretty controversial in some circles. Is everybody still okay? All right. And again, I am not saying that all white people are bigots or activate racial trauma, but we've got it in I'd swear it's probably soaked into our DNA at this point. But it's a lot of us. Any thoughts anybody would like to share before we move on?
I just appreciate the vulnerability and like the transparency from what I have gathered. And even just like your last statements that you said of like it being soaked. I just taught a family systems class in a forensic psychology program. And the vignette we used very briefly was just a white Caucasian family. And everyone was like a lack of culture or a lack of identity. And I was like, is it really a lack, or do we not want to take ownership for what that culture is? And it's one of violence. It's one of whiteness. It's one of white supremacy. And so I just thank you for the approach that you've taken, even for what you are sharing, because it is true. And I don't think we want to acknowledge it. And I think that is vital to acknowledge the fact that it's so immersed that it's the norm. And I think a lot of times my perception is we just pass it off, but like from my perception, it's like, oh, I'm just Christian. And it's like, no, take ownership of white culture, like take ownership of white supremacy. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank
I
you.
completely agree what's been said, and thank you as well for your transparency. We know these things, and these things have been brought to the surface as far as a systematic component to various different areas. So when do we start chipping away at that? How do we start the conversation to address that in a safe space?
Yeah. If I have my way, we will have many more conversations about this in a safe space, because it can be done safely. I think saying that it can't is a cop-out.
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? This is hard stuff. We come from a history that is basically torn apart. It got torn apart before it even got started. And we live in times that are pretty well torn apart too, where all this stuff is coming to the surface in some ugly ways in some places. It's hard work, but I believe we have to do this work. Thank you. I really appreciate your openness. And go share my screen. Okay, let's get on to the 12 ways, and however many ways we get to, right? I will be ecstatic if we don't get very far because we were just talking too much, because you're going to get all that information in a little written thing anyway. So here is the first way. It says racial trauma comes from all directions, right? And I think this is one of the most important things about racial trauma. It's not something predictable, like, if I just stay away from this person or that situation, I can be safe. You may know where a lot of the danger is, but you'll never know where all of it is. And you can't avoid it, not in any reliable way. I don't know where in the world you can go to avoid it at this point. So what are some directions, some of the many directions racial trauma comes from? Anybody?
I mean, I think kind of, you said it comes from all directions. I think it kind of ties into our history, right? So now it's systemic and it's integrated into everything. So it kind of sometimes makes it complicated to recognize it unless you're on the receiving end of it. And even then, you mentioned gaslighting, like, people will also say, no, it's not that, or try to skirt around the actual implications of whatever policy or procedure. So yeah, systemic is one way for sure.
Yeah. And, I happen not to ascribe to the theory that there's not enough to go around. So we have to make sure that not everybody gets their share. The zero-sum game. Has anybody read Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us? If you haven't, please do. I believe that these policies that are so inequitable are not really helping anybody. Maybe some really powerful and rich people, but they're not helping a lot of people who support them even, and they're hurting people. So yes, the policies is definitely one place. History is a treasure trove of trauma. Where else?
I would definitely say education. Especially here in Florida, we have so many things happening that is evolving around education, down to the books you have in the classroom. And it's unbelievable, because you can't learn something because of what state you're in or what county you're in, and it's history. It's things that have happened in real life. These are facts, and that was a huge way that our ancestors were controlled by not allowing us to have education, not learning how to read, not knowing how to do any of those things. And that's why a lot of, Black families, education is so important to them, because it's the one thing you can't take away. You can't take away what I know, my education, things like that. But sometimes it's hard to even get there, to get through elementary school, to get through middle school, to get the knowledge that you truly need. So that way you can be successful and not struggle, the struggles that we go through in higher education, in your master's program, that is not catered to, our ethnic group, and, the way that we were, basically going through everything over the years and stuff like that. So
yeah. And all of the school funding in a lot of places, I'm not even sure how many places, because I confess ignorance to this, but I think a lot of places school funding is based on the tax base in the area. So a lot of people do not have, if they do not live in wealthy communities, they do not have access to a lot of resources for children's education.
the zip code.
The zip code, exactly. And your zip code is, of course, a far greater indication of your health than your genetic code, as the public health people are fond of saying, because it's true. And, the whole idea that if you teach children the truth about history, the white children are not going to be able to take it. They're going to feel bad about being white, or they're going to feel guilty, or they're going to feel estranged from other people. This is just my opinion, but there's nothing more estranging than denying education on the truth. And if people feel betrayed when they learn that that white people aren't the only ones here, or aren't the only ones who are important, maybe they would have been better off if they had learned the truth when they were young, rather than waiting until they were adults. And then, but that's just me. And this is, this is not anybody else speaking, or certainly not any organization speaking. School education. What's another place?
The young lady that just spoke kind of reminded me also, like, in religion and spirituality practices that are accepted or not accepted. I think that a lot of traditional and indigenous practices have been demonized or, made to be as seen as bad. And I think that's another way, definitely, that it shows up so people can't access what they may be called to.
Yes. Yes. One size fits all.
And how about the, this horrible, this political, right? How Trump, yes, there have been, racism has been from the beginning of time. We know this, but somehow all of these horrible politicians that make it okay, that make it more okay in some way to say stuff out loud that they might not have said before, but maybe they were, but now we hear it more, that it's more, that was one of the most damaging things I think Trump has done. And there's a list. He's my least favorite person, but just that whole, the consciousness that's shift, not the consciousness, but the, you know what I'm saying, that it made it more okay, all the things that, which created the whole Black Lives Matter movement. How sad that we have to even say Black Lives Matter, like it's a fucking given. But excuse my French. Anyway, just that level. I don't know how to put it, but you kind of know what I mean. And I just want to also say I loved how you introduced. I loved everything how you put it. It's just so beautifully put. Anyway, it's a great workshop. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you. That's what I wanted to add.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. What are some other ways, directions trauma can come from, racial trauma can come from?
I will say the media for sure. Whichever way you want to take it. Some people call it the leftist media and just too far left, and then the other ones are too far right. But anytime there is a story in a periodical, newspaper, magazine, or whatever, and it's talking about African American history in some way, or just African Americans in general, it's amazing some of the comments that you see saying, oh, this is a bunch of malarkey, this is a bunch of, somebody's writing this and they don't know what they're talking about. It's perpetuating more racism. The people that write it are racist. And I think it's ridiculous. But one of the biggest things that really bothers me is the fact that certain entities will turn around and use words to their advantage. Because we all know what woke means, stay woke. We know that. It is something positive. It's been out since the 70s, I believe. But a lot of people want to use that as the new ugly word. And in my opinion, when they do that, woke stands for white opposition of knowledge and education. That's all I'm going to say.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's like, disclaimer, the Center of Excellence is a federally funded organization, and we do not take any political positions whatsoever. I think it's really hard to talk about this subject without political elements coming in. And we also live in a time when our social media are driven by algorithms that search out and find the most controversial things and the things that are going to make people most angry. And then they pump them into everybody's feed. I guess they call them feed. I don't know. I don't use those things, but where the very internet tools that people use are going to drive them farther toward the left or farther toward the right, in order to get more hits, right? In order to get more attention, and the effect is further polarizing an already pretty desperately polarized situation. So, yeah. What are some other places that racial trauma comes from? Where does it come from in a treatment or recovery support organization? Are there any things, are there any stimuli, are there any things going on, any actions, any words that could be racially traumatizing in treatment or recovery support services?
I would say not being able to access services to begin with. First of all, we have to be able to access the services. And then once the services are accessed, when we are denied an opportunity to express ourselves the way we need to, as a Black woman, I need to be able to express what's going on. So the minimization and the invisibility factors also kick in. So I work in behavioral health, and at work, I'm invisible until something goes wrong, and then I'm hyper visible. And then when I suggest that someone committed a microaggression against me, my experience is then minimized. So it's interesting to me as a Black woman that that as a peer support specialist, my experiences as a person with behavioral health challenges, whether it's mental illness or substance use, I'm paid for that. But my experiences as a Black woman are consistently denied. So how that relates to when I was receiving services was that there were certain things that I would say that I was experiencing, and my therapist, psychiatrist would say, oh, well, that isn't what you think it is. Or maybe it was something else. Basically just shoving or pushing off to the side everything that I was experiencing. How I view the world is through all those different lenses of intersectionality: Black, woman, LGBTQ, being unhoused. So all of those different lenses that I'm viewing the world were constantly being pushed away. And I was told that that wasn't what was important, but it was. The way that people saw me when I walked down the street, the way that people would react to me, all of those added to what I was experiencing and how I felt about it and my reactions. So when I would get angry, of course, it had to be about my symptoms. It definitely wasn't because you said that I spoke well for a Black, that I spoke very well. Or, oh, wow, I didn't realize you were that intelligent. Wow. Okay, just because is that because you think that people with a mental illness aren't intelligent? Or is it that you think Black people are intelligent? I'm confused. So it plays in a lot of different scenarios, whether you're receiving services or giving services. Thank you.
You get the diagnosis of angry Black woman.
Exactly. I get that all the time. And I am angry. And I think I have a right to be angry. And reasons. Multiple reasons.
Yeah. And that is not a symptom. I mean, it's a symptom, but it's a symptom of a systemic thing. It's a symptom of an environmental thing. Who else? I don't know when. I think it was as it became less and less popular to be openly racist, is when white people decided, oh, okay, then we've got to reassure Black people that we are not racist. And there became this almost this unwritten rule of deny it, deny it, deny it, because it's so big and so terrible and so horrible that you can't possibly admit that you said something, then you stepped in it. But what I have found is that if you acknowledge having stepped in it, things can heal. And nobody dies because you acknowledged it. Nobody dies because you admitted that you screwed up. Anybody else? Any other things about how easy is it, like in a mixed race group, for people of color to talk about racial trauma?
It's interesting to see everyone's experience with it and their exposure to it, because everybody has a different experience. It doesn't matter. They could all come from the same community, the same neighborhood. Everyone has a different experience, and the way that they internalized it too, because everyone is very different. So it's really interesting to see, okay, how did this situation impact you? What did it remind you of? What did it make you think, of? You don't really, maybe you see someone who stays away from windows and you don't necessarily know why. Well, they lived in the projects, so you don't stand by the windows because drive-bys, people get shot, that's how you die. So if you don't understand that someone came from an environment like that, you don't understand how some of their behaviors impact the way that they perceive things and make those future decisions, and how they're constantly in survival mode. And I need to make sure that I don't die today because that's priority.
Yep. Yep. And that's why the concept of cultural humility is so important, because I didn't think of that. I didn't think of the thing about the windows. We have to learn. Nobody can really know. As you say, everybody has different experiences, and we have to come right out and admit that we will never know a lot of stuff, and have the humility to ask and listen. Anybody else? And what happens to the human being when an unpredictable threat, and racial trauma is an unpredictable threat, what happens to the human being when an unpredictable threat might come at any time from any direction? How does that affect people? Anybody?
We stay stuck in a state of fight or flight, in survival mode, constantly waiting for the threat to present itself.
Yep.
Very hyper vigilant.
Yes. Very hyper vigilant. Most of you are familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, the ACE study. In case anybody doesn't know, it's a huge retrospective study that really mapped out the connections between childhood adversity, childhood trauma, childhood heavy stress, and physical and psychological and behavioral challenges later on in life. And so they did an amazing job, and they had thousands of people. And these were not clinical populations. These were in a HMO, Kaiser Permanente. And when they mapped out what leads to more serious problems, they found that it wasn't necessarily how severe the trauma was or even how long it lasted. It was actually how many different kinds of trauma people experienced. They called them ACEs. How many ACEs, adverse childhood experiences? In other words, how many directions it came from. It's like something in the mind figures out that there's nowhere that's safe. And the body goes into fight or flight, and the mind divorces itself from the concept of safety. And especially little kids need safety, but adults kind of need it too. So how does this affect your work with African Americans? How does this multi-directionality of it affect your even finding out what's going on with them? Have we already covered that, or anybody else have anything else to say?
I think that there's a fear of being vulnerable. I think that some of the population will test you before they open up. So there's defense mechanisms. They're very mindful of how much they share, where they share, how they share. I think these are all pieces. And I think with trauma and racism, there's a disconnect between the mind and body, which also plays another role in how they approach situations.
Yes. Beautiful. And that's actually one of the 12 ways is that racial trauma makes it really hard to be vulnerable. So wait, knock that one off the list. Yeah, anything else about how it affects your work? How about what we can do to address racial trauma and these effects of racial trauma in treatment and in recovery support? What can we do to address it?
So I think just incorporating all of what we're talking about, right? So understanding so for me, like as a clinician, specifically, I work with trauma survivors, right? So looking specifically at the intersectionality of the individual, right? So everything that we're talking about is one way to approach treatment, right? You know, you have someone sitting or standing in front of you and being humble enough to ask questions and bring the conversations in the room, and explore this person, as opposed to assuming that this person, because they look away or they sound away, fits a particular dynamic, right? So yeah, I think for me, it's about looking at how things like intersect and bringing that in the space.
Beautiful. Yeah. What else?
I think similar to what you mentioned earlier, is being okay having uncomfortable conversations. Anytime healing is involved, like there's going to be pain, it's going to be messy. It's not going to be a simple process, and you may have to revisit conversations at multiple times to kind of gauge and see how each person is doing or how your client is doing. And I think that goes back to, like you also mentioned about, healing through trust. We have to know that there is, on both sides, the person has to genuinely care about the person's well-being.
Yes. It's hard stuff. This takes vulnerability on everybody's part. What else? What about policies? What can you do about the policies in your organization, policies in your community? Can you look at, is there any way that you can find out and influence those?
I think one of the big things, at least at my agency, is, advocating for your client and speaking up when you see, things are not being done correctly or fairly. That has been a big thing. I know it feel like you might be putting a target on your back, but I think that's how we can advocate when we're seeing injustices being done. Because I work in a courthouse, and I work in a specialized docket. So I just try to advocate for my guys. I might not be able to get their charges dropped, but I'm making sure that they're getting housing, making sure that they're doing all those things so that those barriers as to why they might have potentially even got their charge can be minimized.
Sounds exhausting and courageous.
And it all goes down to who you know and who you're able to make connections with in the community. We have a lot of connections with Fort Lauderdale Police Department that come and work with our girls and, to try and bridge that gap. And also we're seeing where they see that disconnect is. And even if you see one familiar face out there in the community, maybe that can help you with feeling safer. So that way those people can also advocate on their end, and it's challenging because it can feel very defeating and you're hitting a brick wall, but you just have to keep putting it out there and keep saying something, even if you may not feel like you're getting anywhere, because eventually it's just kind of the whole just resiliency of it all. Like we have to do that on behalf of them because it's even harder for them to do it. And we're in the field trying to do it and it's just as hard. So I can't, imagining them try to do the same thing and they're exhausted. So we have to kind of carry that, emotional aspect of it because it's like they give until they can't anymore. And a lot of people do stop at that. And that's where it ends.
Yeah. You are painting a really important picture, and I hope that a lot of your colleagues are joining you in these efforts. What about the stress that people are carrying? This isn't the kind of thing that, you can just say, oh, well, just send them in for prolonged exposure therapy and then get rid of the bad memories. It's not about bad memories, right? It's about a whole hairball of stuff. But how many years teach people some simple grounding exercises, calming exercises that can help them deal with that revving up of the stress system that has been sort of a life companion. You can teach them some grounding skills. You can also, how many are familiar with the work of Resmaa Menakem? There's a wonderful book that he wrote. It's called My Grandmother's Hands. And it's about healing racialized trauma, or the trauma of racialized people, shall we say. He is a somatic therapist, but he's also an addiction therapist, and he is a marriage and family therapist, but he has done this wonderful model. And just getting that book, you could use the exercises in that book. You can help people learn to modulate that stress response. And I think you can change your organizational culture too, for the better.
I'm sorry, what's his name again?
His name is Resmaa, R-E-S as in Sam, M-A-A, and last name Menakem, M as in Mary, E-N as in Nancy, A-K-E-M, as in Mary, Resmaa Menakem. And the book is My Grandmother's Hands.
Do you know Peter Levine?
Yes, indeed. He studied with Peter Levine.
Yeah, I'm reading him. I'm a dance therapist, and I work with African Americans and mostly and I do yoga and meditation, and I'm all trying to get more information to do a trauma group, but yeah, the body is really the way out from everything I've read so far. Yeah. The body is the body is so informing how we, even as therapists, feel what's going on. We could feel the tension rising right before there's an explosion. Then after, when the explosion happens, we feel it, I feel it. But the body is such a great pathway to release the trauma. Yeah, anyway, I'll just say that.
Yeah, I totally.
But thank you for this, Resmaa. I'm going to check this person out.
Yeah, definitely. And there are some podcasts that he's done. He's wonderful. Definitely. And how about hiring staff and leadership who are people of color? Something like that can make the organizational culture at least be a sign. So if you're in a position to influence hiring, that's important as well, to have to make places safer. Any more on this part, or shall we go on to the next one? Okay, I'm going to do this share screen thing. The next ones are what I call core psychological wounds. And this is another big one. Racialized trauma dehumanizes people. And by that, I do not mean that it makes people less than human. That is, of course, genetically impossible. But racial trauma treats people as if they're less than human, makes people feel like they're less than human, and denies their dignity and their worth. And this is enormously important in terms of well-being, in terms of safety in this world. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. So what can I do that might dehumanize somebody? Anybody?
I think for me, the first thing that comes to mind is to like isolate someone, right? To put people in corners, to not be to not include them, right? And I think that is a way we can dehumanize, particularly when it comes to racial trauma.
Right, absolutely. And in a treatment agency or something, doing the whole seclusion and restraint thing is a way of sort of dehumanizing somebody. What are some other ways I can dehumanize somebody? What are some other ways that people come in having been dehumanized? What are some signs that you've seen in the people you serve?
I think one of the things I've seen, especially I worked in many settings, but young people who are experiencing mental decline, whether it's because of a traumatic event or whatever the reason is, them being treated as criminals versus someone who's unwell. So we've had people who have needed to be hospitalized, but then they're put in handcuffs to be transported.
Yes, and it makes me think of the school to prison pipeline too. The idea that African-American youth are often criminalized for things that white youth might be just given a slap on the wrist. Yes. What are some other ways people have gotten dehumanized in their lives?
Being noticed and in any efforts that you may take as far as work or whatever is unappreciated. And I find this specifically to be true with African-American women. For some reason, we are the invisible woman.
Yeah.
The word that's at play, that's at wherever.
Right. I can deny your humanity just by ignoring you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or overlooking you, or not including you on the committee that makes the decisions about things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or just merely walking down the hall and turning your head when you see a Black woman approach.
Yeah.
At work, that kind of thing. Yes. I've worked in Alabama, if that helps a little bit. I'm not saying that just happens in the South, but you know.
Yeah, does kind of. Other ways. If I kind of believe on some level that you're less than human, will you see that on my face? Will you know it?
Yes.
What if I try to be really smiley and stuff, but it still shows? Might make it worse.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Because your expressions would be exaggerated.
Yes.
When there's a dislike, there's this little sneer in the nose, and you can see it. And then when you smile too much, even when when your smile isn't matching your words, that incongruence right there lets people know.
Yep.
And then how about the internalization that African Americans, internalize the negativity and then they sometimes believe it.
Yeah.
That's really, that happens, right?
Yep.
Yeah, internalized racism is real. After a while, you begin to believe it, especially when it comes to beauty standards. The reason why so many Black women are headed toward this natural hair movement, because after years of straightening using chemical relaxers to straighten our hair, now we're finding that was, it's causing cancer. So now we're trying to find newer and healthier ways to take care of our bodies because we have children to raise. Most Black women are responsible for raising not only their kids, but their neighbors' kids and their family members' kids. So that's other ways. Dehumanizing can be being forced to only be able to get minimum wage paying jobs, or getting jobs where you're not being paid your worth and your value. And therefore you can't economically support your family and your community. So there are so many ways that we can be dehumanized as people. Going to the hospital and telling the emergency staff you're in pain and they just kind of think you're med seeking all the time. There's so many ways. Being ignored at work, being ignored in the grocery store, being followed around in the grocery store. That is every store I go in, I'm followed around. And I'm a middle class woman. It's so infuriating. I think I get followed around more now that I dress the part than I did when I was probably not, I was probably not doing the right thing. But it's so interesting to me that no matter how high up the economic scale you go, as a Black woman, you're still getting followed in the stores. You're still going to Sam's Club and Costco and people staring at you like you don't belong there.
Yep.
A remedy to that is to turn around and follow them.
Oh,
yeah, I live in Arizona where that could get me shot real quick.
Exactly. And can I just say, you're talking to me, and I'm going to be quiet because I can talk about this forever and ever and ever. But what really bothers me in this particular conversation is the fact that we are having to get a law passed so I can wear my hair any way I want to wear it. Who does that? What century is this? What country are we in? And a lot of states, Alabama included, has not passed it.
I agree. I remember growing up in my teenage years, just getting a job, and that was in the 80s in Chicago. And wearing braids, you wouldn't get a job. If natural hair, heck no, it had to be cut a certain way. You had to have a conservative cut. Chicago seems very liberal until you go get a job. Then it's very conservative, or at least it was back in the 80s. I haven't lived in Chicago in decades, but yeah, braids definitely were not a thing. You had to wait till after you got the job to get your hair done.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. That reminds me of the story that Oprah Winfrey told about how her first job at the news, her first job on TV as a reporter, how she was made an appointment and sent somewhere to a salon for them to straighten her hair and fix it a certain way so that they can make it presentable for her to be on national TV. I had never heard that until I heard that interview.
Yeah, she was in Chicago then. They messed up her hair so bad, she ended up having to cut it short.
But going back to dehumanizing, I just retired from the state of Delaware, and I took a position here at a hospital as a behavioral therapist and social worker in the ER. This position was kind of created, and some of the people, everybody pretty much in the hospital where I work, it's color coded as to what your position is. And I don't have scrubs, and I, as a social worker, I had, this is my 4th degree. And I say that to say that I was on a particular floor and basically was asked be mean. They thought I worked in, because of the colors I had on, they asked me, was I going to bring them their tray for lunch? And I said, excuse me. I said, and my badge clearly stated who I was, but, and it was a older person that worked in the hospital and also a patient, just assume that, not taken away from anyone, but just assume that all I could, and then they made reference that, you work in the kitchen. And I basically was offended, and I told my supervisor, I had only been here like 3 days, but I made sure that I spoke to them, and a doctor came in and asked me for my recommendations, and their mouths just flew open because they were like, oh, one person apologized and the other person just walked away.
Of course, the doctor asks all the kitchen people for recommendations. Ibram X. Kendi said that internalized racism is the real black on black crime. How about something like colorism? Is that another kind of internalized racism?
Absolutely, sadly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that
So
happens. That
but-
happens
sorry.
within cultures too. Sorry, go ahead, sir.
I'm sorry, I'm just you mean like different shades? Is that what you mean by colorism?
Yeah, colorism.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah.
Back in the day with, for sororities, there was a thing where you had to take a paper bag test. And if you were darker than that paper bag, you weren't going to be in that sorority. I'm talking about black sorority. And people have heard of the old Willie Lynch theory. Somehow they say it's not true. Some people say it's not true, whatever. But it seems to be so because we do tend to, if you're light, bright, damn near white, you seem to be respected more, accepted more, even in the black community, as well as the white community. If you have a darker tone, then you are relatively ignored or invisible. And I blame that on a lot of things. I blame it a lot on the media and just the mentality that Black people have from generations of being treated lesser than. You feel better when you think you're better than somebody else, even if they're in your own race.
Well, and there is a tendency of the. Sonia, did you have something? Oh.
I was going to say I wanted to concur. It also can even get down to hair texture.
Yeah, I agree. Colorism dates back to slavery when the lighter enslaved persons were able to work inside the house versus being forced to do field labor. That carried over after Reconstruction and in the Great Migration into the workplaces where you had to be, if you passed, meaning you were lighter, you were able to work and not have to be confined to domestic work. So the colorism thing has been a big part of the Black community in itself, and not just in the United States, but it's also a thing in Africa and in Mexico, South America, all over the diaspora, where even to this day you have African women who are lightening themselves using skin bleaching creams because of that whole European standard of beauty. It just happens everywhere. And ever since race was created as a construct to basically condone slavery, then that has really been a thing. So it's sad, but even in my family, my first daughter dark skinned, my second daughter is light skinned. Everybody immediately felt like my second daughter was the most pretty, and it's like, no, I wasn't going to do that. Especially after growing up, I met one of my friends. I met my friend's mom for the first time, and she said, "You look really pretty for a dark-skinned girl." She was dark as me, and I didn't know what to do with that. And of course, back in the day, I went home and I told my mom, and well, the mama hotline was going in, and there were some not too nice words said. But yeah, so colorism is a very big deal.
I have a friend who was the darkest of the children in her family. And her father was dark-skinned, and he had left the home, and they basically everybody in the family ganged up on her. When she was 4, she wanted to be dead. And she's been struggling in and out of recovery for like 30 years. And I think the colorism had a lot to do with it. Okay, any more before we go on to the next one? What can you do? Well, actually, what can you do to help people, to help restore people's sense of dignity, people's sense of worth in your organization?
I think a big one is meeting people where they are. A lot of the programs that we have, from mental health services to addiction services, these were not created for people of color. And so I've worked in many places where white staff were very knowledgeable, had these amazing worksheets to use with clients that Black people could not comprehend because we did not have access to these services and these words and this language. And so for me, I find myself utilizing the white worksheets and changing the language to meet my clients where they're at, so that they can understand how I'm trying to help them heal. And so I think that's a big piece, knowing people's educational level, cultural competency, right? And so we're able to still share the same information that white people have access to for people of color.
Excellent. Excellent. And, I know people who are working on helping people with test-taking skills, because, 2 people of the same intelligence, one of them may have just been taking tests all their lives and may have it's a whole different set of skills. What are some other ideas for rehumanizing? Pardon?
I'm sorry. I was going to say one of the things is validating people's experiences, and being empathetic and compassionate to their experience, but also kind of like what the young lady was saying about the materials that we present to people, diversifying what we're presenting. We're not just recycling the same materials that's been used for forever, like actually including more new people from diverse backgrounds and modalities, I think is super important, and integrating like indigenous practices and traditional African practices and whatever have you.
Absolutely. And if you have a mixed group, can those traditional African practices also be helpful for the white people in the group? I mean, they're healing practices.
Exactly.
Yeah. Emphasis on strengths. Emphasis on cultural strengths as well. I will put a little advertisement for my next couple of webinars in on the 13th of July and on the 27th of July. I'm going to be doing a couple of webinars on the manual that I wrote called Healing History, using history to make behavioral health services safer and more effective for African Americans. And it's going to talk about how to use the workbook, which has a lot of things about strengths. It's It's for people working in behavioral health, be that in treatment or support or whatever, and how the history of African Americans has affected behavioral health, some of the burdens that it has left, and some of the significant strengths, and how to use those strengths to help people recover. So I threw in a little advertisement for that. But use of traditions, rituals, just respect, and making a safe treatment and recovery support culture, which has to do also with your other staff. How can you influence your staff in general to become more aware of the potential for dehumanization and the effects of dehumanization and ways of helping people feel their dignity, feel that they are valued, and really be that way? How can you influence your colleagues?
I think for me, when I think of how can I influence, and one of the ways that I do is to normalize these conversations, right? Because oftentimes these conversations are kept for times like this. And I think that can oftentimes be a missed opportunity. So being able to just normalize this conversation and normalize how such things show up every day, right? This isn't a secret, it's common. And I think that's how, for me, particularly how I help influence it, is to just bring it in the room.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
And it starts with us. It starts with us having, our own emotional intelligence, checking in with ourselves, checking in with each other, building that community of practice with one another. So that way we know if someone is maybe feeling a little off, hey, maybe you might need to take a case or a client or something, and just being able to have that rapport, it should be a part of our professional development. And we need to follow up on it. Not that one thing you do once a year and then, oh, that was great, we did that activity, we can check that off. But to follow up, having accountability partners and actually following up, including that in whatever rotation, whether it's quarterly or something like that, because things in our lives don't stop just because we're at work, and our biases are always there. And we always have to make sure that we're coming from a good place first, because we could be projecting our own stress on someone else and not realizing that we are, causing harm to them because we're feeling a certain kind of way, but no one else was also able to pick up on that. So it's important that in that space that you have, that your colleagues, you understand your coworkers, what works for them, even if you got a little sign you do to kind of get them to ground themselves before they go into a session, or, hey, so-and-so is dealing with this today. I know you're kind of feeling like this. So just kind of giving you a heads up so you can do what you need to do so you can go in there with a clear mind. Or if you need me to come in there with you, I can do that too. So just knowing our coworkers and really working together and not seemingly like doing things separately. Oh, you do your thing, I do my thing.
I love that idea. I love that idea. Accountability partners. Somebody saying something?
No, I was going to say that most companies now are invested in the equity and inclusion, person and diversity at, in some levels, and that's hopefully that will. I know, like I said, I have retired from the district, but most companies are now doing that. And their job is to educate and provide these platforms to talk about these difficult, to have these difficult conversations and educate everybody as a whole as to have these conversations at lower levels.
Excellent.
I think there has got to be buy-in from upper management. If they're not going for it, you can forget it. And I'm speaking from experience. Everybody has to be involved, from upper management to the maintenance department, if you will. Everybody that's working should be included in these efforts. But getting it approved and promoted, by upper management is a major issue.
Yeah. And what if you work in something like criminal justice or something?
Well, I work for family and
Really hard.
what did they tell you? But anyway, yeah.
And it just occurred to me, trauma-informed care has to be all levels as well. And there are movements to make equity and trauma-informed care go hand in hand. And maybe one way of persuading management is to say, look, because racial trauma is such a big part of trauma, and because trauma is such a big part of inequity, why can't we use some of these resources to support one another and have, is this enough of an excuse to spend time on this and to really do this?
That's a good point. I mean, especially when you look at the disproportionality rate of African-American children in foster care. Now, we are an organization that works with these families. So, and my office trains social workers all over the state. And we do talk a lot about inclusiveness and respecting others and their cultures. But again, there is a major issue somewhere. I think it has a lot to do with that disproportionality rate. People don't know how to talk to people or respect people or relate to people. Again, it has to be buy-in from above, because there's many things that we would love to do, but sometimes, we're unable to.
Yeah.
Trying to use words wisely.
Yes. So since we just have 7 minutes left, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the different, of all that you missed in this and all of the reasons to read the guide when it comes out, which will be very soon, because I hope that you agree with me that it was better to get all of your perspectives and all of your wisdom and all of your experience, or what we could fit into this short time, than it would have been for me to speed date through this whole slideshow and just give you a bunch of information. I hope that worked for you. It certainly worked for me. So we have the next one, racial trauma bereaves people. There is, of course, where there is trauma, there is loss, and there have been incalculable losses throughout history, and there still are incalculable losses. How do we deal with that? Racial trauma robs people of identity and belonging, and identity and belonging are so important to survival and so important to a basic sense of safety in this world. Racial trauma wounds people in their moral core. That's a picture from the Tuskegee syphilis study, where people were basically totally betrayed. The idea of moral trauma is kind of a latecomer to the field, but nowhere, I think, there, in the history of the world, we can get in line to figure out where the greatest moral betrayal has been. But this is a huge area of moral betrayal, betrayal of basic humanity. And how do we deal with what happens to human beings when our basic moral codes are shattered and betrayed? How do we deal with that? Racial trauma silences people. We've talked about that a little bit. You can't talk about it. You can't raise this and talk about some vulnerabilities. Racial trauma wears down the body. If you're familiar with the work of David Williams from Harvard, who in their Harvard School of Public Health and some wonderful things, which he calls these scales about the experience of everyday discrimination. And they have done a lot of studies to show how acts of racism have contributed to physical and emotional challenges, even contribute to, the racism against the mother can contribute to low birth weight and infant mortality as well. And of course, they've known that these things can contribute to early death, to premature aging. Here's a little, there's the thing to David Williams' everyday discrimination scale. If you've got a phone handy and you want to take a picture of that, and anything you can find with him on YouTube. He's just this person who just exudes gentleness and knowledge. Racial trauma makes it harder for some people to accept their vulnerabilities, which we heard, and then ways that it can affect behavioral health services. We've talked about some of the masks that it can wear, that it looks like, it looks like rage, it looks like resignation, it looks like just somebody isn't with it, and it can really be extreme symptoms of racial trauma. That racial trauma doesn't always present itself the way somebody who doesn't know it would think it is. Racial trauma leaves people more vulnerable to misdiagnosis. That somebody mentioned common misdiagnoses. A lot of Black people, Black men particularly, are inappropriately, a diagnosis of depression is missed, and people are much less likely to be diagnosed with trauma than with, say, an antisocial personality disorder or something, and children conduct disorder. So there's a lot of misdiagnosis, and even when the diagnosis is right, do Black people get access to the latest evidence-based medications? Places extra burdens on attachment, trust, and relationships. And of course, attachment, trust, and relationships are very, very, very important to mental health, to behavioral health, and to effective experiences within a treatment and recovery support setting. Racial trauma leaves people longing for escape. And what better way to escape than into alcohol or drugs? How does all of this affect people's ability to stay in treatment long enough for the strength to build when treatment seems like such a hostile place?